Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something a little more cozy. Something to gently ease you into the kind of sleepy historical ramble that you didn't know you needed. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and let's talk about nightcaps. Not the kind you sit before bed, though that's historically related in a roundabout, very indirect way, but the actual hats people used to wear when they went to sleep. Yes, that's right. At some point, humans decided their heads were cold enough to require their own little mini hats at night. Now, nightcaps are weird in a lot of ways, which is probably why they fit perfectly into our sleepy little history. They weren't just functional, they were status symbols, fashion statements, and occasionally, instruments of mild humiliation. If you've ever looked at a portrait of a 17th century aristocrat and wondered why they look like they've just emerged from a very tame wizard convention, it's probably because of a nightcap. And the more elaborate, the more you could tell that, yes, this person could afford to be cold in bed. So why did people wear them? Well, medieval and early modern Europeans were perpetually cold. Castles were drafty, heating was patchy at best, and let's be honest, baths were optional. A nightcap helped trap whatever warmth your body had left after dealing with the bitterly uncomfortable stone chambers of your ancestral home. It was also thought to help with illness, because apparently colds were the 16th century version of just deal with it. And of course, the richer you were, the fancier your nightcap. Some were pointed, some were floppy, some had tassels the size of a small bird. Let's float over to another interesting tidbit. In Elizabethan England, nightcaps were practically a daily accessory for anyone who mattered. Kings and courtiers would wear silk or velvet caps, often embroidered with gold thread. And yes, Elizabethan men looked positively dashing in their day wear, but at night, they looked like a particularly concerned gnome. Queen Elizabeth herself was said to have owned a nightcap collection, presumably color-coded for different moods or occasions, though that may just be gossip. Nightcaps also served a surprisingly practical purpose. They kept hair out of the way. Wigs were common among the upper classes, and a nightcap helped preserve them. Imagine spending 2 hours in front of a mirror, curling and styling a wig only to wake up with it matted and sad. That would be a tragedy for which no one had a proper word, so instead, people wore nightcaps. In a way, nightcaps were early hair protectors, though obviously less effective than modern silk bonnets. Now, you might think nightcaps are a quaint curiosity, the sort of thing we can look back on and smile gently, imagining people dozing off in little fabric cones, but there's a darker, weirder undercurrent here. They were sometimes used to cover baldness, which, again, was considered a mark of shame for men in certain eras. A king with a balding head might wear an elaborate nightcap, embroidered with jewels, just to hide the patchiness. So, in addition to warmth and style, nightcaps also carried an aura of insecurity, which is sort of comforting in a way. History wasn't all grandeur and pageantry, it was also people quietly fretting about their receding hairlines while lying in drafty chambers. By the 18th century, nightcaps became increasingly associated with children and the elderly. Portraits from this period show children tucked into beds with caps that look like tiny wizard hats or soft cones, often knitted from wool. Elderly people were portrayed similarly, partly for warmth, partly as a marker of age. There's something very gentle about this shift, as though society collectively decided that the chaos of adult life didn't require nightcaps anymore. But if you were little, frail, or old, you still deserved that extra layer of comfort. And of course, nightcaps didn't exist in isolation. They were part of a larger ecosystem of bedtime rituals, which often involved ridiculously complicated arrangements of blankets, mattresses, feather beds, and sometimes even heated bricks. Some aristocrats had attendants whose sole job was to ensure the proper placement of these heated bricks before bedtime. You can imagine that conversation. "No, Your Majesty, the brick must be exactly 3 fingers from the edge of the mattress. Otherwise, the nightcap will fail you." Which, in the hierarchy of historical catastrophes, was probably low on the list, but in a sleepy, mildly tragic sense, it's endlessly charming. By the 19th century, nightcaps were slowly fading from adult fashion, but they never entirely disappeared. Victorian men, for example, might wear one during illness or when the central heating failed, which, judging by the diaries of the era, happened with irritating regularity. The nightcap had become less of a fashion statement and more of a practical accessory, though some people, predictably, turned it into an excuse for personal vanity. Reports suggest that certain gentlemen insisted on silk nightcaps, embroidered with initials or family crests, to maintain dignity in repose, because nothing says dignity like a personalized sleeping hat. Interestingly, nightcaps also traveled across the Atlantic. Early American colonists, particularly in New England, adopted them in the 17th century, primarily for warmth. American nightcaps were usually simpler than their European cousins, knit from wool or cotton rather than adorned with gold thread. There's a kind of functional charm here. The American version of a nightcap was less about social signaling and more about survival in a chilly, drafty cabin. But even then, you can imagine a Puritan father tucking into bed with a pointed woolen hat, muttering about sin and taxes, while his children giggled at the sight. So, if you're lying in bed tonight, wearing socks that you may or may not have overthought, consider the lineage of your comfort. Nightcaps represent a fascinating intersection of fashion, health, social anxiety, and personal hygiene, or the lack thereof. They're a reminder that humans have always been a little obsessed with being cozy in very elaborate and sometimes absurd ways. And yes, somewhere in the past, a king or queen probably stared at their reflection, tugged at a tassel, sighed about the draft, and wondered if anyone else was thinking about their bald spot in such excruciating detail. Nightcaps are silly, practical, and slightly sad all at once, which, if you think about it, makes them perfectly suited for a quiet night of historical storytelling. Now, before we drift off entirely into the realm of wool and tassels, let's let our thoughts wander to the next phase of this bedtime accessories story, because while we've covered why they existed, there is an entire world of absurdities in nightcap styles, their cultural significance, and the slightly tragic stories of the people who wore them. But that, my friends, is for the next stretch of our gentle descent into history. All right. Let's drift a little further into the world of nightcaps, but this time we're going to meet some of the people who wore them. And by people, I mostly mean royals and aristocrats, because, of course, history is far more comfortable when it's wrapped in velvet, laced with gold, and slightly ridiculous. Let's start with Louis XIV of France, also known as the Sun King. You might know him for extravagant wigs, elaborate gardens, and the occasional war. But did you know he had a favorite nightcap? Naturally, it wasn't just any nightcap. It was silk, embroidered with gold thread, and probably stitched with tiny sun motifs to remind him of his own glory while he slept. There's something deeply human about imagining the most must be perfectly aligned, or chaos will ensue. And yes, his attendants were there to ensure this, because in Versailles, even your sleeping hat had a court. Now, Louis XIV was hardly alone in this. In England, Charles II, sometimes called the Merry Monarch, though that's mostly propaganda, was known to have an impressive collection of nightcaps, particularly during the colder months. According to surviving letters, he sometimes wore them during council meetings, which, to be fair, makes a lot of sense. Politics is stressful, and apparently, comfort is timeless. But what's really interesting is that Charles II had a habit of insisting that his caps be lined with rabbit fur. Why? Warmth? Yes. Status? Also yes. Slightly unnecessary opulence? Absolutely. And this is the same monarch who managed to restore the monarchy after a civil war, so you know that even the greatest political minds occasionally prioritize fluffy warmth over statecraft. Across the continent, we have Peter the Great of Russia, who introduced Western fashions to a country that had previously been accustomed to more, let's say, utilitarian attire. Peter, ever the reformer, was said to wear a nightcap when he slept, though by all accounts his was much simpler than Louis XIV's. This wasn't because he didn't appreciate comfort, it's just that Peter was busy modernizing an empire and probably didn't have the time to fuss over tassels. Still, some sources suggest he occasionally let it slide, indulging in a little embroidered flourish when no one was looking. And who could blame him? Even Tsars need a soft woolen hat to keep their heads warm in a drafty palace. Speaking of extravagance, let's not forget the Holy Roman Empire. Leopold I, emperor during the 17th century, was famously self-conscious about his appearance, which, given the inbreeding of European royalty, is not surprising. He reportedly had a set of nightcaps designed to accommodate his unusually shaped skull. One can only imagine the fitting sessions, attendants carefully measuring, adjusting, and whispering reassurances, while Leopold pondered whether anyone would ever see him as handsome. History may not record whether the caps improved his self-esteem, but they certainly added layers to his already complicated life. Now, moving to England again, Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, had her own nighttime rituals. She was chronically ill, often in pain, and spent many hours in bed. Nightcaps were essential, both for warmth and for a small sense of control in a life otherwise dictated by illness and political intrigue. Some accounts suggest she had caps lined with fine silk, decorated modestly, because Anne, though politically savvy, was not particularly interested in flashy bedtime fashion. And here's the gently tragic part. Her nightcaps probably offered more comfort than her entire court, which was prone to scheming, gossip, and, ironically, frequent discomfort. It's worth noting, though, that nightcaps weren't always glamorous. For some royals, they were practical, necessary, and occasionally embarrassing. George IV of the United Kingdom, for instance, was famously indulgent in both food and clothing. His nightcaps, padded and oversized, were designed to keep his head warm during long nights of digestion and occasional melancholy. Contemporaries described him looking like a grand sofa in human form, which, if you think about it, is both horrifying and oddly soothing. The nightcap in this context was less a fashion statement and more a defensive barrier against the cold drafts of Carlton House. Even outside the strictly royal sphere, aristocrats had fascinating relationships with their nightcaps. In Germany, some noblemen wore caps so pointed and elaborate that they could double as emergency tent poles in an awkward pinch. This might be slightly exaggerated, but surviving portraits show nightcaps with long, swooping tips, decorated with pom-poms and embroidery. Imagine drifting off with one of these on your head. It's simultaneously ridiculous, slightly majestic, and probably warm. And while these images might make us smile today, they also tell us something important. Humans have always tried to make sleep both comfortable and socially meaningful. Children, too, played their part in this history. Royal children, particularly in France and England, were often depicted in miniature nightcaps, sometimes so elaborate they looked more like ceremonial headdresses than bedtime attire. The caps were practical, yes, they kept young heads warm in cold rooms, but they were also symbolic. Parents could demonstrate care and status simultaneously, ensuring that their offspring were both cozy and properly visible as heirs. The combination of utility and symbolism, as it turns out, is a recurring theme in the strange history of nightcaps. Let's take a moment to linger on one of the more peculiar cases. The young Dauphin of France, son of Louis XV. He reportedly had a fear of the dark, which was, in hindsight, reasonable given the drafty palaces and frequent political upheavals surrounding him. To help, his attendants crafted a nightcap with extra long flaps that could be tucked under his chin, creating a kind of personal tent. It's comforting to picture him, tiny and anxious, cocooned in wool, while the court plotted just beyond his bedroom door. The cap served as both warmth and psychological reassurance, a soft, unassuming piece of armor against the harsh realities of 18th century royal life. Nightcaps also intersected with illness in interesting ways. Tuberculosis, colds, and other chronic ailments were rampant among the elite. A well-lined cap could prevent a chill that might exacerbate a cough or fever. In some cases, the cap was treated with herbal infusions to provide aromatic comfort or slight antiseptic benefits. One can imagine the slightly odd smell drifting through an aristocratic bedroom at night, a mixture of lavender, wool, and faint despair, a strangely gentle perfume of the past. By the 19th century, as central heating became more common, the practical necessity of nightcaps declined. Yet certain figures clung to them for tradition or sentimentality.
Elderly statesmen, widowed queens, and retired generals might still don a nightcap more for the comfort of habit than actual warmth. It's a fascinating reminder that sleep rituals are as much about mental reassurance as they are about physical comfort. In a way, nightcaps outlasted their original purpose, becoming symbols of a gentler, slower, more ritualized era. So, as we drift through the sleepy histories of Louis XIV, Charles II, Peter the Great, and their numerous contemporaries, we see a pattern emerge. Nightcaps were more than just fabric. They were a nexus of status, health, vanity, and minor obsession. They were whimsical, yet necessary, sometimes absurd, often practical, and occasionally tragic. And through all of this, humans consistently demonstrated a remarkable capacity to care, in small ways, for themselves and their loved ones, even if that care involved an oversized piece of wool perched on their head. By now, we can almost see the evolution of the nightcap in real time, from the elaborate silk and gold versions of the 17th century through the pragmatic woolen caps of the 18th century to the nostalgic, sentimental head coverings of the 19th century. Each stage reflects the priorities and anxieties of its era: fashion, warmth, health, and sometimes sheer personal vanity. And through all of it, the quiet, slightly absurd human desire to feel safe, warm, and a little dignified while we sleep. So, tonight, as you tuck yourself in, maybe even with a soft, warm hat or a thick blanket, remember that you are participating in a centuries-old tradition, and that somewhere, in the past, a king or a queen adjusted a tassel on their nightcap, sighed, and drifted off, slightly worried about the cold, but otherwise content in their little world of wool and dreams.
All right, so we've seen nightcaps at their peak, kings fussing over tassels, royal children cocooned in wool, and a surprising number of monarchs quietly fretting about hairlines while their attendants measured fabric. But eventually, as with so many things in history, nightcaps began to fade, and the story of their decline is as gentle and oddly charming as the caps themselves. By the late 19th century, central heating had begun to make castles, manors, and even modest homes less drafty. This might sound mundane, but it's historically significant. Once your bedroom is reliably warm, there's less need to wear a cone of wool on your head while sleeping. Nightcaps gradually transitioned from necessity to tradition, then to quaint fashion statement, and finally to the sort of domestic relic that might appear in a historical painting, but rarely in real life. Yet, even as the practical need waned, nightcaps retained a sort of sentimental charm. Elderly women, widowed gentlemen, and nostalgic aristocrats sometimes continued to wear them out of habit. There's a gentle, almost melancholy humor in this. Imagine a retired duke in a heated London townhouse wearing a pointed silk nightcap while reading the morning papers. He's warm, comfortable, and slightly ridiculous, but that's precisely the point. Nightcaps had become a symbol not of status or health, but of ritual and personal comfort. Some of the strangest cases come from literature and satire. Victorian authors often depicted nightcaps as markers of age, frailty, or eccentricity. A man in a too long cap could be instantly recognized as an absent-minded professor or a fussy relative. Illustrators loved the visual humor: elongated points, oversized tassels, even ridiculous flopping shapes that made characters look simultaneously dapper and absurd. It's fascinating to think that this simple accessory, once a sign of royal sophistication, became shorthand for domestic humor. Nightcaps were also surprisingly culturally varied. In Scandinavia, long woolen caps were sometimes worn with extra weight at the end, a little counterbalance to help the cap stand place on restless sleepers. In colder regions of Europe, caps were knitted in intricate patterns, often passed down from generation to generation. These caps were warm, practical, and occasionally a little itchy, though we can imagine a child or elderly person tolerating it out of love for the craftsmanship. In a way, nightcaps became miniature works of folk art, blending utility with aesthetic care. Even in fiction, nightcaps continued to appear long after they fell out of daily use. Dickens, for instance, loved including them in descriptions of quiet, domestic moments. Tiny bobbing cones in candlelight, elderly men nodding off with a tassel brushing the pillow, children tugging at oversized caps. These images evoke the kind of slow, comfortable domesticity that is perfect for bedtime storytelling. And of course, if a character was supposed to be slightly ridiculous or fussy, the illustrator would exaggerate the cap, stretching it to improbable lengths or adding a comically large tassel. It's a reminder that nightcaps carried social meaning even when their practical purpose was waning. Now, here's a curious footnote. Some medical writers of the 18th and 19th centuries claimed that nightcaps could improve sleep quality. The logic was that keeping the head warm preserved vital heat and prevented illness. Today, we know that sleep quality is influenced by many factors, not hats. But it's fascinating to think of centuries of people adjusting tassels and smoothing fabric in pursuit of better rest. Essentially, nightcaps were an early form of sleep hygiene, albeit a very elaborate and slightly amusing one. By the early 20th century, nightcaps were largely relegated to children's bedrooms, theatrical costumes, and nostalgic illustrations. Adults, for the most part, abandoned them in favor of blankets, central heating, and pajamas. Yet they lingered in the cultural imagination. Think of bedtime stories, cartoons, and nursery rhymes where characters drift off in long, floppy cones. The image of the nightcap became shorthand for bedtime itself, a visual cue that it's time to relax, close your eyes, and let the world fade away. And of course, some people held on to them stubbornly. In rural Europe, particularly in colder regions, older men and women sometimes wore knitted nightcaps into the 1930s and even 1940s. These weren't fancy silk affairs. They were practical, warm, and often patched or mended repeatedly. Imagine an old grandmother tucking herself in, adjusting a faded wool cap that had been in the family for decades, and slowly nodding off. There's a quiet dignity to that, a connection to centuries of sleepy heads and gently worrying attendants. Interestingly, nightcaps also left their mark on fashion and culture in subtle ways. The idea of the sleeping hat inspired modern bonnets, soft hats for warmth, and even novelty pajama accessories. The long, pointed shapes, the tassels, the decorative stitching, they all survive in tiny ways, reminders that humans have always cared, in small but meaningful ways, about comfort and appearance while they sleep. And while no one today wears a tasseled silk cone to bed regularly, the lineage is still there, quietly influencing how we think about nighttime attire and ritual. So, to summarize our gentle meander, nightcaps started as practical solutions to cold rooms and drafty castles. They evolved into symbols of status, vanity, and fashion. Royals fussed over them, children wore them, elderly people cherished them, and writers and illustrators exaggerated them for humor and domestic charm. Eventually, they faded from daily use, but left a lingering cultural impression. And throughout all of this, they remain a small, whimsical window into the personal lives of historical figures, reminding us that even kings, queens, and emperors needed warmth, comfort, and a little absurdity at bedtime. Tonight, as you snuggle under your blanket, maybe with a warm cup of tea or a soft pillow, think of the centuries of people who shared a similar need. Some wore silk, some wool, some embroidered tiny symbols of family or empire, some adjusted tassels obsessively, others tugged them down over anxious foreheads. But all of them, across generations and continents, were simply trying to get a little sleep. And in that shared human experience, quirky, practical, and sometimes a bit ridiculous, we can find a soft, sleepy thread connecting us to the past. So, as we drift toward the end of our history of nightcaps, let's give a quiet nod to the inventiveness, vanity, and gentle eccentricity of those who wore them. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that people have always cared about comfort, even in elaborate, slightly ridiculous ways. And perhaps there's something soothing in imagining that, long before central heating and memory foam mattresses, humans still found small rituals to make bedtime a little warmer, a little more secure, and a little more personal. Nightcaps, then, are more than just fabric. They are a symbol of care, tradition, and humanity's ongoing pursuit of warmth and rest. And as we close our eyes tonight, maybe we can picture a long line of sleepy heads, from medieval kings to Victorian children, nestled beneath blankets, each one adjusting a tassel, smoothing a fold, and drifting quietly into dreams. Now that we've meandered through the rise and fall of the nightcap, let's linger a little longer in the cozy, slightly strange world of historical bedtime rituals. Because if nightcaps tell us anything, it's that humans have always had an odd mix of practicality, vanity, and superstition when it comes to sleep. Take, for example, the practice of sleeping in multiple layers. In medieval Europe, especially among the wealthy, beds could have up to a dozen mattresses stacked atop one another. That's right, 12. Imagine climbing into such a bed, the pressure on your feet, the wobble of the layers, and of course, the ever-present need for a nightcap to keep your head warm. And this wasn't just for comfort. Mattresses were rarely washed, drafty castles were freezing, and colds were taken very seriously. Nightcaps were basically the crown jewel of this elaborate sleep setup. They were the final flourish atop an already excessive bedding arrangement. Speaking of excessive, let's not forget the sometimes elaborate bedtime attendants. Royals often had servants whose entire job was to prepare their master's bedroom for sleep. This included adjusting blankets, arranging feather beds, heating bricks, and, of course, carefully placing nightcaps. Imagine being a chamberlain tasked with ensuring the king's tassel was perfectly straight, night after night. It's a job that requires patience, attention to detail, and perhaps a quiet resignation to life's absurdities. And it's comforting, in a slow, gentle way, to think that these attendants were quietly invested in a tiny human need, warmth and comfort at the end of a long, complicated day. Nightcaps were also entwined with superstition. In some cultures, people believed that sleeping without a cap could invite illness or even bad dreams. The cap, snug over the head, acted as a kind of protective charm, soft, woolen, and reassuring. Parents would tug caps over their children's ears, whispering that the cap would keep away nightmares. It's not a practice rooted in medicine, but in human psychology. The feeling of being enveloped and protected makes sleep easier. So in a way, nightcaps were early comfort objects, predecessors to modern plush toys and weighted blankets. Let's drift briefly across the ocean to early colonial America, where nightcaps were practical necessities but sometimes adapted to local conditions. Colonists often faced harsh winters in drafty wooden homes with minimal insulation. Nightcaps, knit from homespun wool, provided essential warmth. Unlike European court caps, these were unadorned, functional, and occasionally patched multiple times. They were less about social signaling and more about survival, a humble, persistent reminder that human creativity often rises in response to discomfort. And yet, even here, we find traces of style. Some caps were patterned, others had small tassels or turned-up brims. A little whimsy, even in necessity. Interestingly, nightcaps were sometimes a source of mild embarrassment or teasing. Diaries from the 18th century occasionally mentioned children laughing at their parents' long, floppy caps, or servants joking about the length of a nobleman's tassel. Even monarchs were not immune to ridicule. One letter recounts a foreign ambassador noting that the king resembled a wizard asleep due to his pointed silk cap. And of course, this image has endured in popular culture. The long, pointed nightcap has become a symbol of sleep itself, often used in illustrations to signify bedtime or drowsiness. Now, let's take a moment to consider sleep in general during these centuries. Sleep was less uniform than we might imagine. People often practiced segmented sleep, a first sleep after sundown, then a wakeful period for reflection, prayer, or household chores, followed by a second sleep until morning. Nightcaps, snug on the head, would have accompanied both periods. They were not merely decorative, they were companions for extended nighttime rituals, keeping heads warm during quiet reflection or whispered conversations in the dark. Even into the 19th century, there were eccentric variations. Some nightcaps were so long that they doubled as blankets, wrapping the wearer almost entirely. Others had built-in pockets for herbs, small charms, or even hand warmers. It's a small detail, but it reminds us that these were objects of personal expression, not mere clothing. They reflected personality, health concerns, superstition, and creativity, all tucked into one humble, sleepy accessory. And let's not forget the social dimension. Families might match nightcaps by color or design, or create a visual hierarchy in multi-generational households. Children could be distinguished from adults, younger from older, or servants from masters, simply by the shape, material, or decoration of their caps. In a quiet, domestic way, nightcaps reinforced the subtle social structures of the household even as they served purely functional purposes. Sometimes, the nightcap was connected to mental well-being. For anxious individuals, royals included, a snug cap could be a minor psychological anchor, a reassurance that the world was contained and manageable. Think of the Dauphin of France cocooned in his long woolen cap. Think of Queen Anne, adjusting a silk cap in a drafty room, seeking comfort amid illness and political pressure. The cap wasn't magic, it was a small human gesture of care and routine, repeated night after night. In the early 20th century, nightcaps became increasingly rare, mostly preserved in illustrations, nostalgia, and theatrical performances. Yet their legacy persists. Modern sleepwear owes something to them: soft fabrics, comforting designs, and the subtle idea that bedtime can be a personal ritual. Weighted blankets, sleep masks, and even cozy hooded pajamas owe a gentle nod to the centuries of people who cared enough to tug a little hat over their heads before surrendering to sleep. And so, as we approach the quiet conclusion of this extended history, we can reflect on what nightcaps represent. They are at once practical and symbolic, mundane and whimsical, comforting and slightly ridiculous. They remind us that even in the grand narratives of kings, queens, and empires, small personal rituals mattered. They remind us that sleep, warmth, and comfort are universal concerns shared across centuries and continents. And they remind us that history, for all its wars, politics, and dynastic drama, is also about humans seeking a little softness at the end of the day. So, tonight, as you close your eyes, consider the lineage of nightcaps. Picture silk and wool, tassels and embroidery, children laughing, queens adjusting their caps, and kings silently fretting about warmth or appearance. It's a comforting, almost hypnotic tapestry woven from the ordinary and the slightly absurd. And perhaps in that gentle reflection, we find a shared humanity, a centuries-long chain of people doing something very simple, trying to sleep well. As we drift toward the very end of our cozy journey through the history of nightcaps, let's take a moment to consider their echoes in culture, literature, and imagination. Because even though practical use dwindled in the 20th century, the nightcap never entirely vanished. It lives on, quietly, in stories, illustrations, and the comforting rituals of bedtime. In literature, nightcaps appear frequently as symbols of domesticity, eccentricity, and ritual. Dickens, as we touched on before, loved them. Think of his elderly characters dozing by the fire, tassel brushing the pillow, lost in dreams of past events or minor worries. The nightcap in these stories is never threatening. It's soft, quiet, and oddly intimate. It signifies care, warmth, and a slow rhythm of life that stands in contrast to the hustle of streets, courts, and offices. It's gentle storytelling at its finest, a quiet pause in the chaos of the narrative. Cartoons and nursery illustrations took the image further. The long, floppy nightcap became shorthand for bedtime itself. A character in a pointy hat instantly communicates sleep, dreams, or even a little whimsical absurdity. This iconography has persisted for over a century, shaping how children and adults visualize sleep. Even if you've never worn a nightcap, you likely recognize the shape, the tassel, the soft connotation. It's comforting, familiar, and quietly charming. Nightcaps also appear in theater and early cinema. Silent films, especially comedies, frequently use them as visual gags. Picture an old man in a towering, exaggerated nightcap tripping over blankets or trying to navigate a dimly lit room. The humor is subtle, almost sleepy, relying on costume and timing rather than loud spectacle. In a way, these performances preserve the memory of nightcaps for audiences long after practical use had faded. Even in modern sleepwear, there are traces of the nightcap's influence. Hooded pajamas, sleep masks, and even novelty hats for bedtime owe something to the centuries of humans who sought comfort, warmth, and a little ritual before sleep. The philosophy is the same. Small gestures, cozy fabrics, and personal routines make bedtime more restful. Nightcaps were early examples of this idea, a recognition that sleep is not just biological, but cultural, emotional, and aesthetic. And let's not forget the oddly sentimental side of nightcaps. Collectors today prize antique nightcaps for their craftsmanship, patterns, and historical significance. Wool, silk, and embroidered pieces are studied for insight into past domestic life. Every frayed tassel tells a story of a king fretting over warmth, a child giggling at a parent's long, pointy cap, or an elderly person finding comfort in a familiar, patched piece of fabric. In this way, nightcaps are more than just clothing. They are intimate artifacts of human care, ritual, and imagination.
One of the quietest, most poignant aspects of this history is that nightcaps remind us of continuity. Across centuries and cultures, people, especially those in positions of power, responsibility, or fragility, cared about the same simple things: warmth, comfort, and a little control over their immediate environment. The tassel on a king's cap and the knitted wool hat of a child in New England might seem worlds apart, yet they serve the same basic purpose. They are small acts of self-soothing and protection, gentle gestures that humans have repeated for hundreds of years. It's also worth reflecting on the slightly absurd charm of nightcaps. They're practical, yes, but also whimsical. The long points, tassels, embroidery, and occasional comical proportions give them a subtle humor even when worn seriously. And that humor, soft, gentle, and slightly ironic, is a perfect lens for looking at history itself. History is full of grand events, political upheavals, and tragedy, but also small, human, charmingly ridiculous moments. Nightcaps encapsulate this duality: necessary yet whimsical, ordinary yet culturally loaded, functional yet funny. And finally, as we imagine the modern world without nightcaps, it's worth noting that they leave a soft footprint on memory and imagination. They evoke cozy fireplaces, candlelight, drafty castles, and quiet households. They suggest a slower pace, a world in which bedtime was a small ritual of care, comfort, and minor ceremony. And in that quiet, historical way, they are deeply relatable. Even if we don't wear them today, the desire for warmth, security, and a gentle personal routine is timeless. So tonight, as we settle under blankets, with pillows fluffed just right, maybe a soft lamp glowing or the window letting in a hint of moonlight, we can imagine the centuries of humans who shared this same moment. They tugged at tassels, adjusted folds, smoothed fabric, and drifted into sleep. Kings and queens, children and elders, scholars and poets, they all participated in this quiet, comforting ritual. And in that shared experience, there's a subtle but profound connection, a chain of humanity seeking the same gentle comforts. Nightcaps are more than just quirky historical curiosities. They're symbols of warmth, ritual, and the quiet attention humans pay to the small details of life. They remind us that even amid dynastic drama, political chaos, or social upheaval, there were always people lying down at night, adjusting their caps and seeking rest. It's a simple, universal act, made slightly elaborate, sometimes whimsical, and occasionally ridiculous, but always deeply human. And as you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can picture the long, flowing lineage of nightcaps: silk and wool, tassels and embroidery, pointy tips brushing pillows, hands adjusting folds, hearts seeking comfort. It's a gentle, sleepy, human story, a small thread connecting us to the past, reminding us that even in the grand sweep of history, small acts of care endure. So, here's to nightcaps: quiet, warm, slightly ridiculous, and infinitely comforting. A small piece of history that reminds us all to slow down, tuck in, and drift gently into sleep.
Even after nightcaps faded from daily life, they left behind countless small traces in diaries, letters, and household manuals. These traces are like whispers from the past, quiet glimpses into the private lives of people long gone. Consider, for instance, the humble case of servants' nightcaps. While we often focus on kings, queens, and aristocrats, lower-class household members frequently wore them too, though usually plain, knitted, and sometimes patched repeatedly. These caps weren't ornate, but they served the same purpose: warmth, comfort, and a measure of psychological security in cold rooms. It's a reminder that small rituals of care were not just for the elite. They were human, universal, and quietly significant. In some records, we find fascinating details about odd personal preferences. One 18th century gentleman insisted his nightcap be stuffed with a thin layer of wool from a specific breed of sheep, claiming that it added a gentler warmth to the brow. Another diary mentions a noblewoman who preferred her nightcap lightly scented with lavender and rosemary, believing it aided restful sleep. These minor eccentricities hinted the level of thought and care that people invested in sleep, a surprisingly intimate aspect of life that rarely makes it into grand historical narratives. Let's float briefly to the case of theater and masquerade. Even in the 19th century, nightcaps were occasionally worn for costume or play. Actors might don long, floppy caps to represent sleep, age, or domesticity. Illustrators loved them because they instantly conveyed a character's bedtime or eccentricity. The long cone, the tassel dangling off the tip, the slightly sagging fabric, they became symbols, shorthand for quiet domestic moments or gentle humor. And although the real function of warmth had mostly faded, their symbolic power endured. Another subtle aspect of nightcaps was their connection to health. People of the past were surprisingly preoccupied with drafts, cold air, and illness. Bedtime was a precarious moment. A sudden chill could exacerbate a cough, stiffen joints, or provoke what we now recognize as minor discomforts. Nightcaps were part of a broader preventative strategy. In some households, nightcaps were even treated with herbs or lightly perfumed fabrics to comfort the wearer or ward off imagined maladies. There's something softly human about this, a mix of superstition, practical knowledge, and gentle ritual that shows a universal desire to care for oneself. We also find traces of emotional comfort. Historical letters sometimes mention children clinging to nightcaps during stormy nights, or elderly relatives adjusting their caps before drifting off. These simple actions became part of a mental rhythm, a reassurance that the world was still somewhat orderly, that care was present, and that sleep could be a gentle refuge. It's a quiet, almost meditative aspect of life that is easy to overlook, but profoundly human. Nightcaps even appear in marginally humorous ways in correspondence. One 18th century ambassador wrote home describing a king asleep, head swathed in a towering silk cap, tassel bouncing with every snore. Another letter mentioned servants teasing one another about the exaggerated size of a duke's nightcap, imagining it doubling as a small tent. These anecdotes, while minor, show that nightcaps could inspire amusement, tenderness, and imagination simultaneously. They were practical, ceremonial, and slightly absurd all at once. There's also a small tradition of commemorative nightcaps. Certain wealthy families would keep heirloom caps carefully preserved to pass from generation to generation. Some were embroidered with initials, dates, or small motifs representing family identity. Imagine a grandmother smoothing a worn tassel, telling stories of the person who first wore it, and passing it down. It's a tiny, intimate form of historical continuity, an artifact of private life that quietly bridges centuries. Nightcaps also influenced cultural memory and metaphor. Even today, when someone is said to pull on their nightcap in literature or speech, it evokes sleep, rest, or resignation to domestic routine. The imagery persists. The long, floppy point, the tassel, the soft fabric, all suggest comfort, small ritual, and quiet human habits. And in that way, the nightcap, while mostly absent from daily life, continues to shape how we think about bedtime, domesticity, and personal care. We might also consider the emotional resonance of nightcaps. In an era without modern heating, sleep was often challenging. Cold rooms, drafty windows, and the absence of central heating made nighttime discomfort common. The nightcap was more than fabric. It was security, warmth, and a little personal control. For royals, it could mask insecurity or aging. For children, it was protective and comforting. For elderly people, it was habit and reassurance. Across centuries, the nightcap quietly embodied care, ritual, and minor indulgence. Finally, reflecting on nightcaps allows us to notice the slower, quieter rhythms of the past. History often focuses on wars, politics, and public events, but the everyday, private routines like adjusting a tassel or smoothing a fold before bed are equally meaningful. They remind us that despite grand narratives, humans have always sought comfort, security, and small pleasures. Nightcaps were a modest but enduring expression of this universal desire.
So tonight, as we draw our blankets a little tighter and adjust our pillows just so, we can imagine a long line of people, royals, children, elders, and servants, each performing their quiet bedtime ritual. The tassels, the wool, the silk, the tiny adjustments, all gestures of care and comfort repeated across centuries. And as we close our eyes, we join this history, softly, quietly, in the gentle, timeless pursuit of warmth and sleep. Nightcaps, in all their simplicity and charm, remain an enduring symbol of human care. They are absurd, whimsical, comforting, and deeply human, an artifact of quiet life that invites us to slow down, settle in, and embrace the small rituals that make sleep possible. And in that shared human experience, there's a soothing continuity, a reminder that even the smallest, silliest acts can carry meaning, comfort, and a little bit of historical magic.
As we continue floating through the long, sleepy corridors of nightcap history, it's worth considering one final aspect: dreams and the imagination connected to these humble hats. Because nightcaps were rarely just about warmth. They were part of a broader bedtime ritual, and bedtime rituals are inseparably linked to dreaming. In many historical accounts, people believed that what you wore to bed could influence your dreams. A snug nightcap, fitting comfortably over the head, was thought to calm the mind and ward off nightmares. A loosely tied or poorly fitting cap might leave you restless, or even invite bad dreams, according to superstitions. Of course, there's no scientific basis for this, but it tells us a lot about how people approached sleep. They treated it as a delicate, almost ceremonial moment. The nightcap was a gentle talisman, a small control in an otherwise unpredictable world of darkness, imagination, and subconscious thought. Some royal anecdotes highlight just how seriously people took this. A diary from the 17th century recounts a noblewoman fussing with her nightcap, insisting that the tassel must point precisely to the left. She claimed that aligning it in any other direction would invite troubling visions in the night. Whether or not this actually worked, the act itself was calming, a ritual repeated night after night, quietly marking the transition from wakefulness to sleep. It's a reminder that the human need for small, comforting rituals transcends centuries in cultures. Nightcaps were also quietly linked to health and sleep quality. Physicians of the 18th and 19th centuries sometimes recommended them for patients with chills or respiratory ailments. In an era without modern heating, a simple wool cap could prevent discomfort, reduce drafts on the head, and possibly make a restless night a little more bearable. Some people even lined their caps with soft fabrics, or added herbs like lavender and chamomile for calming aromas. Imagine drifting off under a gentle scent of dried herbs, the soft wool snug around your forehead as centuries of similar routines quietly echo around you. It's domestic magic of the gentlest sort. And let's not forget the humor inherent in these customs. Even the most serious historical figures sometimes looked absurd. Diaries and letters occasionally reference kings, queens, and nobles, waking up tangled in oversized nightcaps, tassels dangling across their faces, or hats so pointy they resembled mini tents. There's a soft humor in imagining a serious monarch or austere scholar, head swaddled in wool, trying to maintain dignity while snoring quietly. It's the kind of detail that makes history feel intimate, human, and unexpectedly charming. Nightcaps also intersected with family life. Children often had smaller, simpler versions, knitted lovingly by parents or servants. These caps were functional, yes, but also a form of care, an object of attention, and a small emblem of familial connection. Imagine a child tugging the soft wool over their ears, feeling the warmth, and drifting off under the watchful care of their household. Even centuries later, the feeling is relatable. The same desire for comfort, security, and small rituals continues to shape how we approach sleep today. Interestingly, nightcaps even survived in small ways in 20th century households, especially in rural or colder regions. Older individuals sometimes continued to wear wool caps at night, especially during harsh winters. These were practical rather than fashionable, and often patched or frayed from years of use. Yet there is something quietly dignified about this persistence, a small adherence to tradition, to comfort, and to the slow, deliberate rhythms of life. And beyond the personal, nightcaps left traces in broader cultural memory. In visual arts, literature, and even holiday imagery, the long, floppy, tasseled cap persists as a symbol of sleep, domesticity, and gentle whimsy. It evokes quiet nights by the fire, flickering candlelight, and the soft rhythm of life slowing to a gentle pace. The cap's shape, the tassel dangling, the soft folds of fabric, they communicate a lot without words: warmth, routine, care, and a touch of whimsy. Finally, nightcaps remind us of the universal need for comfort and ritual. Across centuries and continents, people, royals and commoners alike, engaged in similar acts, adjusting fabric, smoothing tassels, making small gestures to ensure warmth, and preparing for sleep. These acts are small, mundane, and often overlooked in history books, but they are deeply human. They are gestures of care, self-soothing, and continuity. And through them, we can feel a quiet connection to the past, a chain of gentle routines stretching across time. So tonight, as you settle into bed, you can imagine a line of sleepy humans stretching back centuries. Kings and queens, children, elderly scholars, servants, and artisans, all performing small acts of care before drifting off. The nightcap, whether silk or wool, ornate or patched, was a small but meaningful part of this shared human experience. It reminds us that history is not only battles, politics, and intrigue. It is also the quiet domestic gestures that help us live, rest, and dream. Nightcaps, in all their charm, absurdity, and practicality, endure as a gentle symbol. They are a soft, silent testament to the human desire for warmth, ritual, and comfort. And in imagining the centuries of people who wore them, we are reminded that small acts, tugging a tassel, smoothing a fold, curling into a bed, carry meaning beyond their simple appearance. They're intimate, personal, and timeless. And so, as you drift toward sleep, picture this history softly unfolding. Long, pointed hats, tassels brushing pillows, children snug in wool, kings fretting about warmth, and countless individuals performing these gentle rituals in the quiet of their rooms. It is a slow, calming, and oddly comforting story, a reminder that across time, humans have always sought warmth, security, and the soft reassurance of a nightcap. As we continue our slow journey through the world of nightcaps, let's take a moment to appreciate the quieter, almost poetic aspects of this humble accessory. Because if nightcaps teach us anything, it's that even the smallest, simplest items in history carry meaning, layers of comfort, ritual, and imagination. Consider the tactile experience. Wool, silk, and linen, the fabrics used for nightcaps, were chosen carefully. They were soft against the skin, insulating without being heavy, and often scented or treated to feel pleasant. There's something inherently gentle about this. Centuries of people, across cultures and social classes, selecting materials that would soothe them into sleep. It's a quiet attention to detail, an almost meditative practice. The simple act of tugging a cap snugly over one's head becomes a ritual of mindfulness, repeated night after night. Nightcaps were also a reflection of personal character and identity. Even in mundane households, small differences could signal personality. Some people preferred caps that were long and floppy, others short and fitted. Tassels varied in size, shape, and placement. Some had embroidery, others small hand-stitch patterns. These variations expressed individuality within a private, domestic setting. The cap was a small, wearable statement of care, routine, and occasionally vanity. Royalty, of course, took these differences to the extreme. Kings, queens, and nobles often commissioned elaborate nightcaps, embroidered with symbols of their family, wealth, or taste. Louis XIV's silk and gold caps, the Dauphin's cocooning wool, Queen Anne's carefully lined head coverings, all were designed to comfort, impress, and communicate subtle messages of status and refinement. And yet, at the same time, these extravagant caps remind us that even the most powerful people in history were human, cold at night, and seeking small pleasures and reassurance. Nightcaps also intersected with literature in fascinating ways. Beyond Dickens, Victorian writers often used them as symbols of quiet domesticity, eccentricity, or introspection. Characters tugging their caps down, adjusting tassels, or smoothing folds become immediate visual markers of bedtime, rest, or contemplation. Even when exaggerated for humor, the image carries warmth and intimacy, emphasizing that sleep is not merely biological, but also cultural and emotional. We also find small connections to folklore and superstition. In some cultures, nightcaps were believed to ward off bad dreams or protect against spirits of the night. The idea was simple. Covering the head preserved the warmth and order of the body, creating a subtle barrier between the sleeper and the unknown. Even if this belief was purely symbolic, it demonstrates an intuitive understanding of psychological comfort. The cap acted as a talisman, a small source of reassurance, and a gentle companion to the mind as it drifted into sleep. Children, too, played a central role in the history of nightcaps. They were often given caps that matched or complemented those of their parents, creating a small familial ritual of warmth and care. The act of putting on a nightcap could be playful, reassuring, and soothing. It marked the transition from day to night, from activity to rest, and subtly reinforced the bonds between caregivers and children. In this way, nightcaps were a small but powerful tool for both comfort and connection. Even the absurdity of some nightcaps adds to their charm. Long, floppy cones, oversized tassels, and improbable shapes. These details might have been impractical, but they are memorable. Imagine a nobleman stumbling to bed, a tassel dangling in his face, a long point folding awkwardly over his shoulder. Or a child tugging at a knitted cone that nearly covers their eyes. There is gentle humor here, subtle amusement that transcends centuries. It reminds us that history is full of small human moments, often overlooked, but deeply relatable. Nightcaps also served as intimate artifacts of memory. Families sometimes kept heirloom caps, carefully preserved and passed down through generations. These objects carried stories, rituals, and emotional resonance. They were practical, yes, but also deeply personal, connecting individuals to their past and to the quiet continuity of human life. In this sense, nightcaps become not just sleepwear, but miniature vessels of domestic history, culture, and care. Finally, reflecting on nightcaps reminds us of the slow, deliberate rhythms of historical life. Sleep was not merely a biological necessity, but a cultivated practice, attended with care, ritual, and attention. The nightcap, simple, whimsical, and practical, embodied this approach. It was a quiet companion to centuries of human experience. Kings, queens, children, elders, servants, and ordinary people, all seeking warmth, comfort, and gentle assurance at the end of the day. As we close this part of our journey, imagine the long line of people who wore nightcaps across time, adjusting fabric, tugging tassels, smoothing folds, and preparing for sleep. Each cap represents care, ritual, and a softly human desire for comfort. And though the form has largely disappeared from daily life, the legacy remains. Nightcaps persist in cultural memory, literature, illustrations, and imagination, quietly reminding us of the universal need for warmth, routine, and gentle self-care. Nightcaps, in all their whimsy, absurdity, and quiet significance, are enduring symbols of human intimacy with sleep. They represent centuries of people caring for themselves and others, performing small acts of comfort and creating subtle rituals that bring warmth, safety, and a little reassurance. And as we drift toward the gentle close of this narrative, it's comforting to remember these small, humble items carried meaning far beyond their practical purpose. They were silent witnesses to the rhythms of life, the quiet care of generations, and the timeless pursuit of rest. So, tonight, as you settle into bed, imagine the long line of people who wore nightcaps across time, adjusting fabric, smoothing and drifting into dreams. The long, soft line of human experience stretches backwards, softly connecting us through a shared desire, warmth, comfort, and the gentle embrace of sleep.
As we drift further into the history of nightcaps, let's pause to reflect on their connection to ritual and routine. Because sleep is rarely just a biological process. It's deeply cultural, emotional, and habitual. And nightcaps, humble as they seem, were central to these routines for centuries. In many households, putting on a nightcap marked the transition from wakefulness to sleep. It was a small, deliberate act, often accompanied by other gestures, smoothing blankets, adjusting pillows, or whispering a final word of comfort to a child or spouse. In this sense, nightcaps were ritualistic. They were symbols of order in the otherwise unpredictable dark hours of the night. The act of placing one on the head created a psychological shift, signaling that the day's work was done and it was time to rest. Historical records suggest that some nightcaps were also personalized for comfort. In colder regions, they were lined with extra wool or soft fabrics. In some aristocratic households, silk caps were lightly perfumed or embroidered with initials, motifs, or family symbols. Each variation reflected a combination of practicality, personal taste, and subtle social signaling. A long tasseled cone could suggest whimsy or elegance. A simple knitted wool cap indicated care, warmth, and modesty. Even in something as private as sleepwear, identity and ritual were entwined. Children, too, benefited from these small traditions. A nightcap could serve as a comforting object, much like a blanket or soft toy today. Parents would tug them snugly over ears, adjust tassels, and sometimes whisper reassurances as children settled into bed. These were quiet, domestic moments, small rituals repeated nightly, shaping early experiences of comfort and security. In this way, nightcaps were more than practical clothing. They were instruments of emotional care, passed down from generation to generation. Royal households, naturally, added layers of complexity. Kings, queens, and courtiers often had attendants to help prepare the night, including adjusting nightcaps. Imagine the chamberlain carefully smoothing silk, aligning tassels, and ensuring that, even in sleep, the monarch projected order and dignity. Diaries occasionally note minor frustrations, a tassel out of place, a cap slightly askew, or the monarch fidgeting in the night. It's a quietly human image, one that reminds us that even rulers, in the private hours of the night, were concerned with warmth, comfort, and small rituals. Nightcaps also intersected with medical beliefs. Physicians and household guides in the 18th and 19th centuries recommended covering the head at night to prevent colds, chills, and general discomfort. While modern medicine has a different approach, the logic is understandable. Drafts were real, rooms were cold, and sleep was fragile. A simple wool or silk cap could make the difference between a restless night and a calm one. And beyond the physical, it provided psychological reassurance, a small measure of control in a world full of uncertainty. Interestingly, some historical accounts describe elaborate nightcap traditions for specific events or conditions. For instance, during illness, patients might receive a nightcap infused with herbs like lavender or chamomile, intended to soothe both body and mind. Royal children or convalescent nobles might have multiple caps on hand, changing them nightly for comfort or cleanliness. These practices underline the fact that nightcaps were never purely decorative. They were functional, symbolic, and emotionally significant. The whimsical side of nightcaps also persisted in everyday life. Diaries and letters sometimes include humorous observations, servants teasing one another about oversized caps, children tripping over long tassels, or elders struggling to keep elaborate cones in place. These moments are gentle reminders that history is filled with small, human absurdities. Quiet humor embedded in the fabric of daily life. And in imagining these scenes, we find a sense of continuity. People centuries ago experienced warmth, care, frustration, and amusement in ways that are deeply relatable. Even as nightcaps declined in daily use during the 19th and 20th centuries, they remained part of cultural memory. Illustrators continued to depict them, writers continued to reference them, and theater costumers kept the tradition alive for performances. The long, floppy, tasseled cone became a visual shorthand for sleep, domesticity, or eccentricity, an instantly recognizable symbol that transcended practicality. And in that symbolism, nightcaps achieved a kind of immortality. They became more than clothing. They became icons of the private, domestic, and introspective life. Finally, nightcaps serve as a reminder of the quiet, intimate side of history. They reflect ordinary human concerns, warmth, comfort, routine, and care. They tell us about domestic life, family dynamics, childhood, aging, and ritual. And they remind us that history is not only about wars, politics, or public events. It is also about the private, mundane, and sometimes whimsical acts that give life texture and meaning. So as we settle into the final stretches of this narrative, imagine the centuries of humans who have performed these quiet rituals, adjusting fabric, tugging tassels, smoothing folds, and drifting into sleep. From kings to commoners, children to the elderly, nightcaps were a shared gesture of care, comfort, and small human consistency. And in that gentle continuity, we find something deeply soothing, a connection across time, softly linking the present to the past. Nightcaps, in all their subtle absurdity and quiet charm, remain a testament to human ingenuity, care, and the timeless pursuit of rest. They are small, intimate artifacts of history that remind us of the importance of comfort, ritual, and minor acts of self-care. And as you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can picture a long line of sleepers before you, each performing these small, gentle acts in their own way, tugging a cap, smoothing a fold, and drifting peacefully into dreams.
As we draw our journey through the history of nightcaps to a close, let's take a final, slow look at what these humble hats tell us, not just about fashion or royalty or domestic life, but about human nature itself. Because at the heart of it, nightcaps are more than fabric and tassels. They are symbols of comfort, ritual, and quiet continuity. Consider the fact that across centuries, cultures, and social classes, people cared about the same things: warmth, comfort, and a little reassurance before sleep. Kings and queens fussed over silk caps. Children tugged at knitted cones. Elders adjusted tassels in drafty rooms. Across all of these lives, one small object, a nightcap, served as a tangible gesture of care, routine, and self-soothing. That continuity, quiet and uncelebrated, is profoundly human. Nightcaps also remind us that even small objects can carry meaning. They were practical, yes, but also whimsical, symbolic, and emotional. They bridge the gap between necessity and ritual, health and superstition, fashion and personal comfort. A long, floppy cone could signify domesticity, elegance, eccentricity, or even mild absurdity, all at the same time. And that duality, practical and symbolic, is what makes nightcaps fascinating. In literature, art, and cultural memory, nightcaps endure as icons of sleep and domesticity. The tassel brushing the pillow, the gentle fold over the forehead, the soft, comforting fabric, they evoke warmth, routine, and intimacy. Illustrators, writers, and storytellers preserve the nightcap as practical use waned, creating a visual and symbolic language that continues to resonate today. The cap itself becomes a metaphor for rest, for domesticity, and for the small, human gestures that make life feel gentle. Perhaps most importantly, nightcaps illustrate the value of small rituals. In a world full of grand historical events, wars, dynasties, revolutions, these tiny acts of care and comfort remind us that daily life is made up of small, deliberate gestures. Adjusting a tassel, smoothing a fold, tugging a cap over the ears, these are acts of mindfulness, repeated night after night, quietly shaping our experiences of rest and security. They may seem trivial, but they are profound in their constancy and universality. Nightcaps also connect us emotionally to the past. They carry stories of childhood, aging, domestic life, and quiet anxieties. They whisper of parents soothing children, servants attending to nobles, and ordinary people finding warmth in cold rooms. Every frayed tassel or patched piece of fabric holds memory, care, and human ingenuity. In imagining these moments, we gain a sense of continuity, a connection across time, and a gentle reassurance that our basic human needs, comfort, warmth, routine, remain unchanged. And so, tonight, as you lie beneath blankets, perhaps with a soft pillow tucked under your head, take a quiet moment to imagine the long line of sleepers before you. Kings, queens, children, elders, servants, and ordinary people, each performing their small, quiet rituals of care, adjusting nightcaps, smoothing blankets, tugging tassels, and drifting gently into sleep. Across centuries, across continents, these gestures link us together in a slow, comforting chain of human experience. Nightcaps, in all their absurdity, charm, and practicality, are enduring symbols of this quiet human pursuit, warmth, comfort, and the gentle art of preparing for sleep. They're a reminder that even in the grand sweep of history, the small domestic moments matter. They're the gestures that soothe, reassure, and sustain us. And they are, in their own whimsical, sleepy way, a testament to the continuity of human care and imagination. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine a soft line of nightcaps stretching across time, silk and wool, tassels brushing pillows, gentle folds covering foreheads. Imagine children, nobles, elders, and servants, each performing these small, quiet rituals. And as you drift off, remember that this act of care, this pursuit of warmth and comfort, is not new. It is timeless, universal, and profoundly human. In the end, nightcaps are more than mere sleepwear. They are a symbol of our shared human desire for comfort, security, and small moments of calm. They remind us that even in the most mundane objects, in the tiniest rituals, there is history, care, and continuity. And perhaps, as you sink deeper into sleep, there is a soft comfort in knowing that, for centuries, people just like you tucked in, adjusted their caps, and let the world fade away. Good night.